Writer and activist Freddie Deboer is out with a new book. Let's go ahead and put it up on the screen. Excited to dig in this one. The headline is How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. It is available today, and Freddie joins us now to discuss. Great to see you, my friend.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. What inspired the book?
I just had a feeling in sort of early 2022. So I sold the book in May of 2022. I had just feeling that I was just going crazy because a couple of years earlier, everyone was talking about revolution. Every day you read a new overheated piece about how we had to sort of shake society by its foundations, that we would not settle for reform, that everything had to be torn up by the roots. And then in a couple of years later, it just felt like everyone had kind of decided to sideline that, ignore it, and pretend like it didn't happen because they were embarrassed by the fact that nothing changed. I think that the events of 2020 indicated very deep and very real problems with our country, and that those problems need to be met effectively, and that didn't happen in 2020. And if you take those problems seriously, you have to ask, how can we do this better in the future? And that's what the book is all about.
Freddie, one of the things that leaps out, you mentioned the Washington Post review. I had it up in front of me, and it's one of those where they kind of take issue. They're like, well, Freddie Deboer ostensibly says the left was co-opted here by elite movements, that they were defeated in their aims, and as you said, now too embarrassed to talk about, like specific instances that you kind of go into in the book about where you think that was the most prevalent.
Well, I can tell you one of the things that invited just rage very early in the process. So at some point, the publishing company unleashed the table of contents onto the world before the book itself was available. And one of the chapters is titled BPMCLM, which means Black Professional Lives Matter, but Black Professional Managerial Class Lives Matter, excuse me. And the argument is, I think, both completely just sort of undeniable, but also very controversial, which is that the activists who made up Black Lives Matter are not like the median Black American. They're not even like the median Black Democrat. Now, I want to say very quickly that that's okay. It's not their job to be avatars of, median Black experience. Their job is just to advocate for what they think is right. The problem is that the media just sort of took whatever Black Lives Matter activists were saying as sort of the gospel of what sort of Black popular opinion was. And we know that that's just not true. I cite a lot of polling in the piece, for example, that it's simply not the case that the average Black American wants to abolish the police, defund the police, or even reduce police presence in their neighborhoods. In fact, in poll after poll, Black respondents say that they want the police presence in their neighborhoods to remain the same or to even increase in dramatic majorities, which of course makes sense. If you are among a class of people for whom violent crime is much more likely to occur, it's natural to want more police in your neighborhood. If you have less property because you're more poor as a class of people, it's natural to want more police in your neighborhood. But that kind of attitude was really verboten within our elite media class in 2020 because they wanted to associate all of Black America with a sort of very thin slice of the activist class, which is hyper-educated, which is overwhelmingly concentrated in urban parts of the country, which is enculturated into a certain elite sort of status and vocabulary, and which sort of emerges from this meritocratic space. In fact, the median Black Democrat, so the more left-leaning, the average person is fairly liberal economically, but in fact, the median Black Democrat has always been slightly to the right of the party's mainstream when it comes to social issues. And it's just not true that every Black American is a radical activist, and it would be bizarre if it was.
So, but you wouldn't deny that there was an organic, national, widespread reaction in response to the murder of George Floyd, and that the core of that reaction was about changing the way that police operate, and specifically changing the way that police operate in overwhelmingly Black neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, again, the basic premise of this book is that anything that we have a moral duty to do, we have a moral duty to do well, right? So if you say we have a moral duty to prevent police violence against Black people, I would absolutely agree. I would say that that's one of our most sacred political duties right now. And we did a terrible job of it in 2020 of advancing that cause. There is just profoundly little on the ground difference in terms of how policing is being done in this country. In a moment in which we had enormous media attention, when there was more goodwill than you can possibly imagine, I think that this is forgotten. As I refer to in the book, there was a period immediately after George Floyd's murder when even majorities of Republicans in some polls were expressing favorable views of the Black Lives Matter protests. That was an incredibly fertile moment for real change, and real change didn't happen. So yes, absolutely, the George Floyd moment was a moment in which we should have gotten serious and made some real changes to American policing. I think that the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which was a bill that went before Congress, is flawed like any other big omnibus legislation is, but I think it had a lot of great provisions. Unfortunately, it sort of died in the middle because the activist class said that it was a watered down compromise and they didn't want to hear about it being sort of a major goal. And then, it sort of got lost in the mire of democratic centrism on the other side.
So let me get you to respond to one piece of the Washington Post review, because they're talking about, you're making the case here that basically, nothing really changed. At federal level, like, that's indisputable. Nothing changed, literally. But they say, at the local level, there were things that happened. And I'll just read this quote. They say, though he makes much of the lack of ensuing federal legislation, not all meaningful change takes place at the national level, and not all institutional overhaul is enshrined in law. BLM prompted innumerable legal reforms in states and cities, among them the reallocation of police funds in LA, bans on chokeholds and tear gas in Colorado, but it also inspired a generation of progressive prosecutors who vowed to change the criminal justice system from within. What's your response to that sort of pushback?
Sure. So, I think as I go through in the book, a number of those reforms have since been rolled back. Minneapolis, which is where George Floyd was killed, is the prototypical example where the city council responded to that by voting to dissolve the current police department and build a new one. That was then in the future changed to simply reducing the budget of the existing police force. And then after that, they increased the budget of the existing police force. So everything was completely undone over time. There have been some things that have been salutary in specific locations, but I also mentioned things that appear not to have worked. So, for example, in Portland, where drugs have been effectively decriminalized in many ways. So you essentially get a ticket and an offer to go to rehab, but no one's forcing you to go to rehab, and has led to just spiraling overdose rates in those places. But the overarching point I would make is, again, compare what she is saying as success to the demands that were being made in 2020. Again, we weren't saying, let's have some limited local reforms that create some sort of positive good for police violence against Black people. No, what was being demanded was that we completely change our relationship towards race. Those reforms don't amount to that. The median Black American, the average Black American out there, is likely seeing nothing substantial in the differences with their local police force at all. And at some point, you have to ask, right? Like, all this money got poured into a bunch of institutions who did things like, create scholarship programs or beef up their DEI wings. That you have to ask if that's actually the lasting impact of the 2020 moment, just that a lot of bureaucrats got paid.
Well, I don't think there's any way, not interested from your book or just objective analysis, to say that that's obviously what happened. That's why I think that your PMC point is so accurate. It's like, oh, well, now every company that goes public on the NASDAQ has to have like a Black or a minority person on the board. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't change the way that they do business. Or as you said, whenever we're talking about DEI bureaucrats that ever explode, but there's no evidence that it's actually helping like materially the lives of, your average like Black working class citizen. You write, or that what they take away of yours is that leftist movements are to have a greater impact in the future. He concludes they should strive to reflect the interests of the working classes, agitate for material, not merely cultural reforms, and focus on what Deboer regards as a universally invigorating question of economic inequality rather than racism and sexism, which he takes to be more divisive. Now, she takes a little bit of an issue with that, but defend your thesis then. You know, we always have the war. We've had it here plenty of times on the show. It's not race, it's class, not war. They're inextricably linked. You're following much harder on the economic question. Why is it, though, that if you do care about those interests that were originally expressed, which I totally agree, that a very small sliver pre-riot, May 2020, where something actually might have done, why would that have been a better tack than what ended up happening in the first place?
This is kind of a petty thing that I used to do. This was mostly a thing that I would do in fights about Bernie versus Hillary in 2016. But I've been doing it for a long time, which is when I'm in online, shitposting with people, and I am in a fight about sort of identity politics versus class politics, I would copy and paste a quote from one of the Black Panthers and just put it out as though it was something that I was saying. So, for example, Bobby Seale, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, said, "Ours is not a race struggle, ours is a class struggle." Or Fred Hampton is someone who said over and over again that you can't beat racism with Black capitalism, you beat racism with communism. I would just take those quotes and I'd throw them out there without attributing them. And then people would say, "Oh, look, what a racist, class reductionist you are." And then I would reveal that it was Black Panthers who had said those things, because I'm a petty person. But the point is that this stuff is written into the history of the liberation struggles for people of color. It's written into the history of feminism. If you go back, for example, to the periods of the suffragettes, it would have been totally bizarre for them to sort of say, well, there's sex issues, gender issues, and then there's economic issues. Core to their complaints were that those things were intertwined. The reason we should appeal to class is because it's just math, right? One of the things I've said in the book, which some of its critics have ignored, is that, look, conservatives play identity politics as much as liberals do. If you want to sort of attack identity politics in theory, you should be attacking Republicans as well as Democrats. The problem is Republicans are in a much better position to do identity politics, because identity politics that appeal to white people in states that are overrepresented in our system because of the Senate and the Electoral College, that's just always going to be more powerful politically than it is going to be to appeal to Black people who are in an enclave like Atlanta or DC, to queer people who are in an enclave like New York and San Francisco. Reality is just there's a lot of white people. 70% of the electorate is still white, even though only 59% of the country is white at this point. The electorate is 70% white. White people are overrepresented because of the Senate and the Electoral College. You just can't win that way if you keep doing it. But what you can do is you can say, hey, look, we have differences of opinion and differences of culture and differences that are racial or ethnic or whatever. But just about everybody knows what it's like to be really freaked out about how they're going to get their rent money this month, right? And that potential coalition is just bigger than the coalitions that can be built by a bunch of Brown graduates talking about intersectionality. It's just from pure political math. Class is going to beat identity politics, in part because the whole point of elite identity politics is to nominate yourself as part of a minority of the enlightened.
So, Freddie, I want to ask you about this because this is something that I'm sort of working through in real time. So, the Democratic Party has made, the mainstream factions of the Democratic Party have made it pretty explicit that, they don't really care about a working class base. They're happy to win if it's with more affluent, like college-educated liberals. In this past election, you still had a majority of lower-income people voting for Democrats, but this was the most sort of like college-educated, affluent coalition they've ever had. But then you have, especially in places like Minnesota and Illinois and Pennsylvania, you have governors and legislatures that were elected with this more affluent college-educated base that are genuinely doing better things than Democrats were doing during the Clinton era, better things than Democrats were doing during the Obama era. They're actually paying attention to unions. They're actually in Minnesota strengthening collective bargaining. And even with Joe Biden, who I've got all kinds of ideological issues with, his National Labor Relations Board has been one of the most important institutions for working class people and unions, that has existed in my lifetime. You might say that's a low bar. It is, but it's still way better than what was done under Obama, way better than what was done under Clinton, and like the sort of uniparty union busting that has been happening for most of my lifetime. So how do you square those two things? That at the same time that the coalition has gotten more highly educated, more affluent, more liberal, more upscale, you actually have some better wins for workers, especially if you focus at the state level.
Yeah, so I mean, I would never suggest that there's no advantage to having the votes of people like me, right? I mean, I want to be very clear about this. I am a member of the class that I am critiquing in this book. I lived in Brooklyn for many years. I have a PhD. I write for fancy doodah publications, et cetera. I'm a part of that class, and I'm grateful for their support. I would say a few things. First, that people like that tend to be reliably hit or miss on foreign policy. So, for example, there simply appears to be no sort of like Park Slope resistance to funding Ukraine for the rest of our lives, right? Like that's not, they don't care about that stuff. It's wonderful things that have been happening with these narrow majorities. But in the long run, you have to look at the structural state of the Democratic Party, which is two things that are very important. Number one, college enrollments have finally seriously leveled off after growing for more than a half century. All right, so I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but there's finally been the start of a plateauing and maybe even a slight decline in the percentage of young people who are heading off to college, probably because they're cost sensitive and they don't want to graduate with $200,000 worth of debt. And so, number one, like the primary growth of the Democratic coalition in recent years has been this dramatic sort of a shift since the turn of the century, when college-educated people are now heavily Democratic. But the other problem is that, as Roy Teixeira will tell you, the emerging Democratic majority myth, which is that the browning of the United States, sometimes people call it, right, the increasingly less white United States, that was going to create a permanent Democratic majority. That has been just proven to be entirely false. Hispanic voters have been sprinting in the direction of the GOP. And we should have always suspected that was going to happen. I mean, you listen to people talk about Hispanic Republicans as these race traitors or something. You say to them, look, if I say to you that I know a guy who lives on the border of Texas, who owns his own ranch, is an NRA member and a devout Catholic, you'd say, oh, that's a Republican. The fact that he's Hispanic doesn't fundamentally change all of those other signifiers, right? Moving forward, if the losses from non-white voters are real, and the Hispanic people continue to grow as a portion of the population, while the Black population, which is the most reliably Democratic bloc, stays stagnant as it has been for a long time, the math again just doesn't look good. So I'm very happy with what people are doing in these states with these narrow majorities, and that's great. And thank you to all the voters of like Georgetown or wherever who are sort of powering these sort of like white liberal Democrats who are very socially left. But the reality is, big picture, long term, it doesn't look great for Democrats. And this is all happening in a period when there's just total incoherence at the top of the Republican Party. You can imagine if there was an actual competent candidate, right? Someone who like knew what they were doing and didn't have appear to have a brain injury like Donald Trump, that they could be making incredible inroads right now. And I think it's a frightening time.
So, Freddie, the last question I have for you, which is something that's been very inconvenient for my worldview, which is not dissimilar from yours, about the importance of material politics, about, foregrounding class, about the importance of having multiracial coalition if you want to sort of, not only build out political power, but consistently notch wins that are for the working class. One thing that's been very inconvenient for me is how powerful abortion politics have turned out to be. I mean, post Roe versus Wade, listen, Republicans still won the House, but we have to acknowledge the red wave certainly did not materialize, even at a time when Americans were saying my economic situation is absolute shit and I don't trust the Democrats on the economy, et cetera, et cetera. Abortion was really key in sort of overcoming that tide in the other direction. We've seen in terms of special elections this year, Democrats have outperformed by 10 points on average, not in like one isolated incident, but on average in every special election we've had this year. And, it's not 100% abortion, but that's a really big part of it. So how does that square with your political theory? And I'm partly asking this in a selfish way because I'm trying to figure out how it squares with my political theories of change as well.
Well, I actually think that speaks perfectly to sort of my overall point here. What do we know about abortion? It is a cross-race, cross-class, cross-education level, cross-religion, etc. issue, right? Abortion is like one of the great stealth issues in American politics, which is, I think, part of what happened with the demise of Roe v. Wade is there's a lot of women who might ostensibly be pro-life, who have like a sort of intellectualized rejection of abortion. But when they're confronted with the possibility of carrying a baby to term that they don't want to, right, suddenly their self-interest activates and they realize I could be put in a position I really don't want to be. I think abortion is a perfect example of an issue that's incredibly rare, which is that it's salient across all of these divides of ethnicity or education level or income, et cetera, where every woman is in a state that does not have guaranteed right to abortions is at risk of having her life permanently altered by a pregnancy that she doesn't want to. And so that is the kind of appeal that we need to make to people. The problem is look, of course, we have to fight for trans people who are a population that is incredibly vulnerable and that faces all kinds of discrimination and violence. Of course, we have to fight for Black people who are, just by every statistical measure, taking it on the chin still 60 plus years after the major civil rights victories of the last century. But we have to do so in a way that demonstrates to people that it is in their best interest to be part of these coalitions. I try to tell people this all the time. I'm a Marxist, and they think it's weird when I talk about the politics of self-interest. Like only Ayn Rand ever talked about the politics of self-interest. In fact, Karl Marx himself said, look, the only way you ever move people politically is by appealing to their own best interest. And so you need to find a way to loop other people in with that. I think we can do that if we say to people, hey, housing is insanely expensive. Childcare and education are insanely expensive. Healthcare is insanely expensive. These are structural problems that the Republicans have no answer for. Let's look for things that actually work and can help all of us together.
That's a really excellent answer, and this has been a really good discussion. Guys, we're going to have a link to the book down in the description. We encourage everybody to go and buy it, and we really appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been really enjoying it, Freddie. Congrats again, and great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.